right? Thanking God and praising him again for some things we have thanked him for in the past. That being his persistence in teaching us when it's a little bit tougher to get the concepts he's giving us, even when the concepts aren't as complicated as our willingness to accept them. And beyond his persistence and his compassion in teaching us the way in which he teaches us, as we have mentioned, from multiple perspectives. Let's look at that whole concept of the cross before the crown from yet another perspective, and that being the way in which he leads by example in this chapter, Mark chapter 10, that I'm going to approach from, I guess, a little bit different angle, understanding that these chapters, the entire Bible, can be taught from so many different perspectives that a single 5 to 10 minute lesson does not really do an entire chapter justice. But I want to try to focus on 2 points around which I think this chapter can be told or narrated, even though, of course, it has a standard sequence that I want to identify. But those 2 points I think it might revolve around in terms of being flexible in the telling of the themes that come out of this chapter's narrative are, once again, the way in which he uses children as an example of what it really means to enter the kingdom of God, and that other point of his emphasis on his own death and resurrection. The third time he is going to warn them about the way in which that is on deck. But the basic layout of the chapter is that he is going to start out with, once again, crowds gravitating to him, which is going to draw the ire, the resentment, the frustration of, once again, the Pharisees, maybe the Pharisees in this chapter. I don't remember who really is it this time. I understand I use the Pharisees too much. It is the Pharisees in verse 10 verse 2, who are going to have another question for him, this time challenging him on the law of divorce and presumably divorce and remarriage, understanding that will go from verses 1 through 12. He is then going to pick up in what seems to be a different direction with that illustration from the children in verses 13 through 16, helping them to understand what it really means to be able to effectively enter the kingdom of God before he goes on in verses 16 through 31 to face a familiar question that we saw back in Matthew, and that being one who was described as a relatively rich young ruler is going to ask him, what do I still lack? A question he is going to answer in, if we haven't already said it, verses 16 through 31, at which point it's going to seem to shift again to that other point of emphasis, I guess, we might be able to view the themes in this chapter around, and that being the fact that he is going to actually walk ahead of them as they approach Jerusalem, quite frightened about what's next, because they at least understand enough to understand that there is danger ahead, as for the third time he is going to warn them about his death and resurrection. That being in, as we mentioned, verses 32 through 34, verses 35 through 45. Then, once again, having him deal with a question, this time from James and John, much like we saw in Matthew, asking for a prominent position when he comes into his kingdom, almost as though they don't hear as much as they heard. It's clear that they don't seem to be fully processing the fact that he's basically said he's about to die, because they're going to ask one to sit on his right hand and the other to sit on his left when he comes into his kingdom, a teaching point that is going to lead into what seems to be another transition, as Mark seems to have a bunch of disparate stories collected together that actually do seem to provide us some consistent themes, as many different directions as the stories may seem to point. The reason why I say that is the last story in the chapter, going from verses 46 through 52, deal with the healing of a blind man by the name of Bartimaeus. And the reason why I say I think that this chapter really does consistently fall along at least two themes is that when you look at that whole concept of accepting the kingdom as little children, that section in verses 13 through 16 really connects to almost all of the other stories in this chapter, except for the one that shows him healing blind Bartimaeus. And it does connect, but just in a different way. But it connects to, I think, every other part of the chapter, understanding that the challenge for everybody that he's teaching in this chapter, whether it is the Pharisees or the rich young ruler or his own disciples, hinges on whether or not they can accept the thing that he is teaching them as a child, meaning removing the filters to truth to simply understand what he is literally saying. And for the Pharisees, they are not going to understand his plain teaching on divorce and remarriage unless they are able to accept it as a little child, unfiltered. Understanding it's the same challenge for us today. We are not going to be able to understand his teaching on that topic unless we are able to, as a little child, remove the filters to the plain things that he is saying. Likewise, for the rich young ruler, he is not necessarily going to be able to understand the level of sacrifice that Christ is calling him to. And even if he can understand it, he is not going to be able to accept that level of sacrifice, giving all to follow Jesus, unless he accepts that one thing, or his Christ's teaching on that one thing that he lacks, as a little child, removing the filter that has probably set in over his life, along the lines of the attachment that he has formed to all the things that he has. Those attachments that are providing a barrier to him simply accepting the teachings of the Christ. And likewise, Christ is 3 times, for the 3rd time, having to tell his apostles that he's about to die, and it's still going to seem like it hasn't sunk in. Why? Because immediately after that story, he's getting another question related to where do I rank in the kingdom, this time from James and John, who are still missing the lesson that he is trying to give them about sacrificing all. The same lesson he's trying to teach to the young ruler, because they are still fixated on being exalted above all. Of course, except for Christ, because he's the most powerful figure in their orbit right now. And it would just seem ridiculous to try to be promoted above him. But rest assured that if they began to see themselves as his equal, they might be trying to exalt themselves above him as well. And that other focus or point along which I think the themes in this chapter can be viewed is the fact that he is teaching them all by example, emphasizing his lesson to the rich young ruler by, in the next story, walking ahead of everybody to Jerusalem, the place where he knows he's about to die. And whether they have completely processed it or not, they know that there's danger ahead. And so he is not hiding back in the crowd or lagging behind them. He is walking ahead of them, giving a living example of what he has told the rich young ruler. Not so much merely about the need to sacrifice all, but as much as he doesn't want to do it, him leading the way to the place where he is going to sacrifice all. And then likewise with his apostles, it is not simply him telling them that they need to sacrifice all. It is him living out the example of proper priorities, prioritizing sacrificing all, as opposed to trying to seek your own promotion to be exalted above all. And then finally, getting back to the point that he seemed to make a chapter ago with the little children, not so much the point that he makes in this chapter, the need to accept the kingdom as a little child, but the need to look out for even the least in the society, showing them compassion. That's literally what he is going to do. Even though he is facing death, he is not going to bypass or overlook blind Bartimaeus, somebody that everybody else seemed to be quite willing to have him bypass without helping. And so he is once again giving them an example of what it means to show genuine compassion for those who are in need, no matter how low they might rank. Which seems to be just one of the ways that his lessons about putting the cross before the crown is emphasized by the things he is actually doing, by the example he's setting. Which is why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, please give us the strength to emphasize the things that you give us to say, by the courage to do the things you have called us to do.